In the quiet town of Westwood, Alabama, nobody suspected that something dark was lurking beneath the surface of the Walker household. Reverend Isaiah Walker, respected by everyone, stood as the town's spiritual leader. His sermons drew crowds every Sunday, and people saw him as a man of wisdom and strength. To the outside world, his life seemed perfect. But what the townsfolk didn't see was the strain inside his home. While Isaiah focused more and more on his church, his wife Ruth began to feel lonely and overlooked. Their conversations had faded into nothing but small talk about daily life. Behind closed doors, the perfect image of the Walker family was slowly falling apart. The cracks were starting to show, and something was about to break. Westwood, Alabama, was the kind of place where everyone knew each other. It was a small, tight-knit town where neighbors exchanged smiles and everyone showed up to church on Sundays. At the heart of this community was the Greater Faith Baptist Church, a place where families gathered to hear Reverend Isaiah Walker preach. The church wasn't just a building, it was the foundation of the town's life. Isaiah, a tall and commanding figure, stood at the center of it all. His voice carried power, and his words reached deep into the hearts of those who listened. People admired him for his strength, his wisdom, and his ability to lead. But while Isaiah gave his all to the church, his home life was slowly crumbling. His wife, Ruth, was the quiet pillar behind him, always standing by his side. Yet, beneath her calm appearance, Ruth was tired, and the years had worn her down. The distance between them was growing, but neither Isaiah nor Ruth seemed to know how to fix it. This wasn't just a story about a pastor and his wife, it was about what happens when a family starts to break from within and no one is paying attention. Isaiah Walker was a man deeply dedicated to his work. Day in and day out, his life revolved around the church, the people, and his duties as a pastor. He was a man of faith, admired for his commitment and leadership. But that same dedication left little room for his personal life, especially his marriage. Over time, his relationship with Ruth, his wife of over 20 years, became more of an afterthought than a partnership. Ruth was always there, in the background, quietly supporting Isaiah as he led the community. She was graceful, patient, and dependable, but behind closed doors, the cracks in their marriage were becoming harder to ignore. Isaiah's focus was elsewhere, and Ruth was left to deal with the growing loneliness in their home. Their conversations had grown brief and shallow, often limited to church matters or day-to-day tasks. Ruth had spent years feeling like her role in the marriage was more about maintaining appearances than being a true partner. The weight of it all was starting to get to her. She longed for the connection they once had, but it all started innocently enough. Ruth had grown used to feeling invisible in her own home, but that didn't stop the ache inside her. It was during one of those long, empty days when she first noticed Terrell Anderson. He was young, energetic, and full of life, everything Ruth hadn't felt in years. At just 19, Terrell was dating Ruth's daughter, Monique, but Ruth found herself drawn to him in ways she couldn't explain. At first, it was nothing more than small glances during church events, moments where their eyes would meet across the room. It seemed harmless, just a passing curiosity. But something deeper was brewing beneath the surface. Each time Terrell came to visit Monique, Ruth felt a strange pull, and soon enough, she found herself looking forward to his visits. Ruth knew it was wrong, but the loneliness she felt at home made it easy to justify those brief moments of attention from Terrell. It wasn't long before their small conversations started to feel like more. A connection began to form, and before Ruth knew it, she was caught in something much bigger than she had anticipated. What began as stolen glances was quickly turning into something dangerous. By the summer of 2012, the affair between Ruth and Terrell had crossed a line neither of them could turn back from. What started as harmless eye contact and casual conversations had grown into secret meetings. They would find secluded spots around town, places where they wouldn't be seen, and these meetings were filled with a kind of excitement Ruth hadn't felt in years. It was thrilling, dangerous, and completely against everything she stood for, but that only made it harder for her to resist. Ruth knew the stakes. She knew the damage it would cause if anyone found out, especially Isaiah. But for the first time in years, she felt alive. Terrell, despite his youth, made her feel important, like she mattered. And that feeling had become something she craved. On the other hand, Terrell was equally conflicted. He knew this relationship was wrong for Ruth, wrong for Monique, and wrong for his future, but the pull of their affair was too strong. Their meetings became more frequent, and the lies they told to cover them up grew bolder. Ruth would sneak away from church events, finding excuses to be alone, while Terrell distanced himself from Monique. It was only a matter of time before things spiraled out of control, but at that moment, neither of them seemed ready to stop. By early 2013, the tension between Ruth and Isaiah was impossible to ignore. Isaiah, absorbed in his ministry, had started to notice the growing distance between them. Ruth seemed more withdrawn, often avoiding conversations or spending time alone. She had become distant, and even though Isaiah sensed something was wrong, he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He was too busy with the church, and every time he tried to talk to Ruth, the conversation stayed on the surface, never addressing what was really going on. Isaiah's suspicions began to grow, but he chose not to confront them. Instead, he buried himself even deeper into his work, hoping that whatever was wrong would fix itself. He couldn't afford distractions from his role in the community, and as much as he loved Ruth, his dedication to the church had become all-consuming. Ruth, meanwhile, felt the walls closing in. The affair with Terrell was weighing heavily on her, but she couldn't bring herself to stop. The attention she received from him was like a lifeline, pulling her away from the emptiness she felt at home. Each day, the gap between Ruth and Isaiah grew wider. Their once loving relationship was now just a shell, and the unspoken tension between them was becoming too much to bear. Isaiah could sense that something was about to give, but he had no idea just how close he was to the truth. As February 2013 rolled around, Isaiah's suspicions deepened. He noticed the late-night outings, the subtle shifts in Ruth's behavior, and the way she seemed constantly on edge. Her absences became more frequent, and though Ruth had always been good at hiding her tracks, Isaiah could sense that something wasn't right. He had tried to ignore it for months, but now it was impossible. His instincts told him that Ruth wasn't just overwhelmed or stressed, there was something else going on. One night, when Ruth told him she needed to step out for a church matter, Isaiah decided to follow her. He wasn't sure what he would find, but he knew he couldn't continue living in the dark. He kept his distance, quietly trailing her through the streets of Westwood, his mind racing with possibilities. When Ruth pulled up to an old, abandoned shack on the outskirts of town, Isaiah's heart sank. The scene in front of him confirmed his worst fears. Inside, Ruth met Terrell, and the sight of them together sent a shockwave through Isaiah. He had spent years sacrificing everything for his family and his congregation, and in one moment, it all came crashing down. Fueled by rage and betrayal, Isaiah stormed into the shack, unable to hold back the anger that had been building inside him for so long. What happened next was a blur: shouting, accusations, and then Isaiah, in a fit of uncontrollable fury, grabbed the nearest object, a crowbar. Without thinking, he struck Terrell with all his strength, the blow leaving the young man crumpled on the ground. Blood pooled beneath him as Ruth screamed, but Isaiah was already fleeing into the night, his life changed forever. The moment Isaiah swung the crowbar, everything changed. The rage that had been building inside him for months exploded in an instant. Terrell didn't stand a chance. The blow was brutal and quick, and the young man collapsed to the floor, blood spilling onto the cold, hard ground of the shack. Ruth's scream echoed through the small space, but Isaiah was beyond hearing. The man who had spent his life preaching forgiveness and faith had crossed a line he could never return from. For a brief second, Isaiah stood frozen, staring at what he had done. The gravity of it hadn't fully sunk in yet. He had just killed a man. Ruth, horrified and panicked, rushed to Terrell's side, but it was too late. There was no saving him. The silence in the shack was suffocating, broken only by Ruth's sobs and the sound of Isaiah's footsteps as he turned and fled into the night. Isaiah didn't stop to think, didn't try to understand what had just happened. He ran, his heart pounding, his mind in chaos. In one moment of uncontrollable fury, he had destroyed everything: his family, his reputation, and the life he had built. The man the town had once looked to for guidance was now a killer on the run. The next morning, February 23rd, 2013, the quiet town of Westwood woke up to a nightmare. A group of teenagers, looking for a place to hang out, stumbled upon the old shack on the edge of town. They weren't expecting anything more than a rundown, abandoned building, but what they found inside left them frozen in terror. Tyrell's body lay lifeless, surrounded by a pool of dried blood. The laughter that had filled the air moments before was replaced by panic and disbelief. The police were called immediately, and the scene quickly became the center of attention. Detective Marcus Johnson, a seasoned investigator, arrived at the shack and immediately sensed that this was no ordinary crime. The brutality of the attack, the way Tyrell's body was left, it all pointed to something personal, something fueled by deep emotion. It wasn't long before the whispers started to spread through the town. Everyone knew Tyrell, and now the news of his death was tearing through Westwood like wildfire. Isaiah, meanwhile, had gone into hiding. He returned home briefly, but he was a shell of the man he once was. The guilt was crushing him, but he couldn't bring himself to face what he had done. The town was buzzing with rumors, and though the truth hadn't yet surfaced, the tension was thick in the air. Ruth, in shock and grief, tried to keep herself together, but the weight of what had happened was too much to bear. The murder had shattered everything, and there was no turning back. As the investigation into Tyrell's murder began, Detective Marcus Johnson wasted no time in getting to work. He had seen his share of violent crimes, but something about this case felt different. The brutality, the location, the lack of immediate suspects, it all pointed to a crime of passion. This wasn't a random act of violence. Someone had wanted Tyrell dead. The police combed through the shack, searching for any clues that could lead them to the killer. The bloodstains, the signs of struggle, and the overturned chair all painted a grim picture. It didn't take long for word to spread around town that something terrible had happened. People started talking, speculating about what could have led to such a horrific act, but the pieces weren't falling into place yet. The detectives began interviewing family members, friends and churchgoers, anyone who might have known Tyrell or had seen anything suspicious. But it seemed like no one had the answers they were looking for, at least, not yet. Meanwhile, Isaiah kept his distance, trying to maintain a low profile, while Ruth remained silent, knowing that the truth was hanging by a thread. The community was in shock, but the real truth was still buried, waiting to be uncovered. 2 weeks after the murder, the investigation was at a standstill. Detectives were struggling to find a clear lead, but then the whispers around town started to shift. People mentioned seeing Ruth out late on the night of the murder, and soon enough, Ruth Walker found herself sitting across from Detective Johnson. Her calm, composed exterior had shattered, and the weight of the secret she had been carrying was finally too much to bear. Ruth broke down, confessing the affair with Tyrell and how it had spiraled out of control. She spoke of the stolen glances, the secret meetings, and how the guilt had consumed her. But when it came to the murder, Ruth maintained that she had no part in it. She claimed she had no idea who had killed Tyrell, though her involvement in the affair painted her as a central figure in the whole tragedy. Her confession rocked the town. The story of the pastor's wife having an affair with a young man had people talking in hushed tones, and for many it was hard to believe. But now that the affair was out in the open, the investigation took a new turn. The detectives knew they were closer to uncovering the full truth, and Ruth's confession only made Isaiah's erratic behavior stand out even more. The walls were closing in on him, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. After Ruth's confession, Isaiah's world began to unravel faster than he could handle. He stopped showing up at church, stopped giving sermons, and started avoiding everyone in town. The man who had once been a symbol of strength and leadership now looked like a shadow of his former self. He locked himself away in his house, refusing to answer calls or meet with his congregation. People in the community noticed, and the whispers about the Walker family grew louder. Isaiah's guilt was eating him alive. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Tyrell's lifeless body and heard Ruth's screams. The murder had shattered his life, but what haunted him most was the realization that there was no escaping the truth. His hands had spilled blood, and no amount of prayer could wash that away. He was haunted by what he had done, but he wasn't ready to face the consequences. The pressure kept building, day by day. Isaiah grew more paranoid, more erratic, and it was clear to those who knew him that something was seriously wrong. He isolated himself completely, convinced that the truth would stay buried if he just stayed out of sight. But deep down, Isaiah knew the clock was ticking. It was only a matter of time before the walls he had built around himself came crashing down. By the time March rolled around, Isaiah was barely holding on. His once commanding presence had faded into a man consumed by guilt and fear. He had stopped going outside altogether, avoiding even his closest friends. Inside his home, he spent his days in silence, pacing, replaying that fateful night over and over in his mind. Sleep escaped him, and when he did manage to close his eyes, it was only to be met with nightmares of what he had done. The pressure was unbearable. Isaiah couldn't look at Ruth, couldn't face the reality that his wife's betrayal and his own actions had destroyed everything they had built. He knew people were talking, that the town was buzzing with rumors, but none of that mattered. The guilt was crushing him from the inside, and he couldn't escape it. Isaiah's once clear mind had turned into a mess of confusion and regret. He could hear Ruth moving around the house, but their once warm relationship had turned into cold silence. He avoided any contact, not just with Ruth, but with everyone. The walls were closing in, and Isaiah knew he couldn't hide much longer. The secret he had been trying to bury was about to come to light, and he was powerless to stop it. On the early morning of March 20th, 2013, the weight of Isaiah's secret became too heavy to keep hidden any longer. The quiet streets of Westwood were still, but the tension in the air was undeniable. Just as the sun began to rise, police cars pulled up in front of Isaiah Walker's home. Inside, Isaiah sat in his study, surrounded by his books and papers, but his mind was elsewhere. He had known this day was coming, and now it was here. When the officers entered the house, they were met with silence. Isaiah didn't resist. He barely moved as they approached. He had spent weeks haunted by his actions, and now it was as though all the fight had drained out of him. The man who had once led his community with pride now seemed lost, defeated by the weight of his own guilt. Isaiah's arrest didn't come with shouts or struggles. It was quiet, almost surreal. As they led him out of the house, a few neighbors stood at their windows, watching in disbelief. This was their pastor, the man who had baptized their children, married their friends, and led them in prayer. Now, he was being taken away in handcuffs, and the reality of it was hard to accept. As Isaiah was driven away, the town was left in shock. The man they had trusted was now facing the consequences of a crime that had torn the community apart. There was no turning back. By mid-April 2013, the trial of Reverend Isaiah Walker was all anyone in Westwood could talk about. The courtroom was packed, with many familiar faces from the church and the community filling the seats. People who once looked up to Isaiah now sat with heavy hearts, unsure how to reconcile the man they had admired with the crime he had committed. The air in the room was thick with tension, a mixture of disbelief, sadness, and curiosity about what had truly happened that night. The prosecution laid out the events clearly, leaving no room for doubt. They painted a picture of a man who had discovered his wife's affair, followed her to the shack on the outskirts of town, and in a moment of uncontrollable rage, killed Terrell Anderson. The affair, Ruth's confession, and Isaiah's suspicious behavior in the weeks leading up to his arrest were all brought to light. Isaiah's defense team tried to shift the narrative. They argued that Isaiah had been pushed to his breaking point, emotionally manipulated by his wife's betrayal and the pressure of leading a congregation. But it was clear that no matter how they framed the events, the evidence was overwhelming. Ruth's testimony, though painful, was central to the trial. She stood before the court and recounted the affair and Isaiah's discovery of it, describing in detail how the events unfolded. The community was torn. Some still held on to the image of Isaiah as their leader, a man who had made a terrible mistake in a moment of weakness. Others felt a deep sense of betrayal, realizing that the person they had trusted with their faith had harbored such darkness. As the trial went on, it became clear that this was more than just a murder case. It was the unraveling of a family and a community's trust. By the end of April 2013, the jury had reached its decision. After days of tense testimony and emotional recounts, the courtroom was silent as everyone waited to hear the fate of Reverend Isaiah Walker. The evidence was undeniable: the affair, the rage, the brutal act that had ended Terrell's life. The jury didn't need long to deliberate. When they returned with a guilty verdict for second-degree murder, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Isaiah sat motionless, showing no outward reaction, as if he had already known this would be the outcome. The weight of his crime had been on his shoulders for months, and now the official judgment had arrived. For many in the community, the verdict brought a sense of closure, but it also left a deep scar. Isaiah had once been their trusted leader, a man they turned to in times of crisis, and now he was being held accountable for a crime that shocked everyone. The congregation, the town, and even his own family would never be the same. As the judge handed down the sentence, life in prison, the whispers began to spread through the room. Some felt justice had been served, while others struggled with the reality of the man they had once admired. Isaiah's legacy, built over years of service, was now in ruins. His future was sealed, and the town of Westwood was left to pick up the pieces of what had once been a tight-knit community. The pastor who had preached about redemption was now the one in need of it. In the weeks following the trial, Westwood was left in a state of disbelief. The once thriving Greater Faith Baptist Church, which had been a pillar of the community, was now a hollow reminder of the scandal that had torn it apart. Many of the congregation stopped attending services altogether, unable to reconcile the man they had once trusted with the brutal reality of his crime. The church, once filled with families seeking guidance, stood empty. Ruth, overwhelmed by the weight of her involvement in the tragedy, quietly left town. She couldn't face the whispers, the stares, or the judgment of a community that had once respected her. The scandal had left her life in ruins, and there was no repairing what had been broken. The affair, the murder, and the trial had not only destroyed her marriage, but had left deep scars on everyone involved. Detective Marcus Johnson, who had spent months piecing together the events leading up to Terrell's death, couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a murder case. It was a tragedy that had shaken the entire town, making people question their faith, their trust, and their beliefs about the people they thought they knew. The case of Isaiah Walker wasn't just about a single act of violence, it was about the collapse of a family and a community's shared trust. The aftermath would linger for years, leaving behind broken relationships, lost faith, and unanswered questions about how something so dark could grow in a place so deeply rooted in faith.